Alright, what's up guys, and welcome back to another Yu-Gi-Oh video. So today's video is going to be talking about faded cards. I have made one video in the past where I was kind of just talking about how to tell the difference between a legitimate factory error and a sun-faded card. Today's video is going to be a bit different. We're kind of just going to be talking about how faded cards as a category have just taken off in the last year or so. And kind of going through the different, I guess, sub-varieties within faded, stuff that there is to collect, how to go about valuing faded cards, and things like that. So yeah, just starting out with like the basics of what we're talking about in this video. So here's a regular card, regular hollow trap hole. This is how it's meant to look. And a faded copy is going to be one which has some of the magenta ink missing. Now, I'm not going to talk that much about this this time, just because I've already done another video about that, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But a faded card is one that doesn't have the magenta. So here's like pretty much the most extreme example you could hope for. Trap hole on the left has all magenta. Trap hole on the right has pretty much zero magenta, and they look very different. Now, in the past, these two cards, obviously there are different editions and grades and stuff like that. But if they were the same, the value difference wouldn't be that big. You might find someone who would pay a little premium a few years back for a faded card, but on the whole, honestly, the value is very similar to just a regular full saturation copy. But in the past few months, especially, but pretty much throughout the whole of the past year, the amount of collectors out there looking for faded cards has massively increased, to the point where, honestly, I would say it's probably the foremost variety that is collected in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! So before, like, wavy and glossy would have been the two most important things to collectors. But at this point, the premiums we're seeing for faded cards are much bigger than the premiums that we ever see for wavy print cards. So I would say they have actually overtaken wavy and glossy in the past few months. So the first thing I guess we'll do, I've just shown you this trap hole example. We'll kind of go over the different main types of cards you can find with a fade, and kind of how to go about identifying them to show that they are faded, and how they look different between a full saturation and a faded copy. Now, fading is also a spectrum, so I'll go over the different like levels of fade as well. But we'll start with kind of an extreme example of each end. So next up are magic cards, which are probably the least desirable faded cards. And I'll show you why now. This is a full saturation Wavy Unlimited Swords of Revealing Light. Here is a pretty much maximum fade first edition Swords of Revealing Light. And you can see that there's some subtle differences in how the background looks. It's kind of a slightly richer green on the faded copy, but pretty much the cards are very similar. The difference is nowhere near as big as with the trap holes I just showed. Actually, the biggest difference on magic cards, and the best way to kind of identify if they are faded or not, is by the border of the text box, that is. So this is a full saturation copy, and you can see it's got the normal kind of orange to red color on that border. This is a maximum faded copy, which means all the magenta is gone, and you've got like a kind of yellow color instead, which is pretty noticeably different. So for cards like this, I would say there's still not a huge premium for faded magic cards. People will pay a premium, but generally only when the artwork itself looks different on it. So Swords of Revealing Light is probably the worst example of that. There's a little bit of magenta missing from the background. It looks a little more blue than it does on the full saturation copy. But overall, these two cards look extremely similar. And that's why the value difference isn't that big. Because collecting faded cards is pretty much all about aesthetics and not about kind of value as such or rarity. So that's magic cards and trap cards done. We'll look at fusions next. So here's a full saturation Gaia the Dragon Champion with that kind of deep purple of an old school fusion. Now, fusions are kind of the card type, along with traps, that changes the most. And you get a lot of different shades depending on how faded the card is. So next up, this is a very rare card. This is the hardest card to find from LOB with a fade. Another Gaia the Dragon Champion. This is a pretty strong fade, and you can see that it already looks like clearly different to the full saturation copy. But if you find like another copy that's even more faded than that, there's still quite a significant difference there. So give me a second, and I'm just going to dig out one of the most iconic cards in my collection, which is my Faded Flame Swordsman. And now you should be able to see when I bring this one on camera. There's still a noticeable difference even between the Faded Guy, the Dragon Champion here, and the Flame Swordsman in terms of the background color, the whole look of the card. And I would say there's a big difference in each of these cases as to how much value the fade adds. So with a kind of fairly faded fusion where it starts to look a bit gray on the background, like this one in the middle, it'll already add quite a lot of value to the card. But when you get the fusions faded to the point where it looks blue, almost like a ritual card, that's when it really adds a lot of value. And it can be many, many times the value of a non-faded copy in the current market. So that's 3 of the card types out of the way. The other 2 types are both monsters as well. Firstly, vanilla monsters, which are the most common types of cards to find faded, just because there's a lot of them in LOB and MRD, which are the sets that you find the most fades from in general. Here's a full saturation Curse of Dragon. Then we're going to move to a lightly faded copy. And again, the colors already look pretty different. This copy is a lot greener than the one on the left. But this is not an extreme fade. I wouldn't say this is really adding much value to the card. Maybe you'll find someone who pays 10-20% extra because it looks kind of cool, but it's not a huge difference. Whereas next up, if we bring over a really faded Curse of Dragon, you can see that this one has a really green shade compared to even the one in the middle. And the best way to tell on monsters how faded the card is, whereas with spell cards, for example, it's that border I showed you. With monsters, it's generally the stars. So on a normal card, the stars look completely normal. They're very clearly marked out, the different parts of the star, and you can see the shape of the star, everything like that. On a lightly faded card like this, it starts to look a little bit less clear, but you can still kind of see the shape of the stars pretty easily. Whereas on a really full-blown fade like this Curse of Dragon on the right, there's pretty much nothing left in those stars. I mean, you can kind of see a little bit of contrast in there, but more or less, because the contrast is between yellow and red, and most of the red ink is missing from the card, it's very hard to make out anything on those stars. And actually, same with the attribute for dark monsters. You can see that dark text is getting really hard to read compared to a full saturation copy. Yeah, so that's vanilla monsters out the way, and that just leaves effect monsters. So here's a full saturation Man-Eater Bug. Then we can put that next to a pretty much maximum fade Man-Eater Bug, and you can see again that huge difference between them. There aren't as many effect monsters from LOB. It's pretty much just Man-Eater Bug and Exodia that you can find with a fade. But you get a lot of faded effect monsters from Metal Raiders. And I might as well just put one of those here to show you the difference between, like, comparing different sets. So MRD is, at the end of the day, a different print run from LOB. You don't tend to find the fades quite as extreme as you can with LOB, but even when you do, they kind of look different to how the LOB ones look, just because the basic colors of the card, even if they're full saturation, get changed from print run to run. You know, the ink is changed up for a different one, and so they don't come up looking exactly the same. Now this Time Wizard is actually also less faded than the Man-Eater Bug, which you should be able to hopefully see from the stars. But irrespective of that, the background color looks a lot less green, I guess, than an LOB effect monster, even if it's still very clearly different to a full saturation monster. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for the different degrees of fading, I guess. In terms of varieties that you get within faded, there are a few things to point out there as well. So if we bring back this Curse of Dragon, put it next to this Trirorn Dragon, both of these are unlimited LOB cards, pretty much faded to the maximum degree possible. But if you're looking at them side by side, you should hopefully be able to see that the color balance isn't actually the same on them. And the reason being is that this Curse of Dragon on the left is an example where the other parts of the printing process are also affected by the same error that's causing the magenta to be low. So this Curse of Dragon is pretty much missing a bit of every color strip, even including the black. So the text should be exactly the same thickness and darkness on both of these cards. But in practice, the Trihorn Dragon has much darker and bolder text than the Cursed Dragon. And same in the border. The border is just kind of a darker shade on the Trihorn Dragon. So that is, I guess, just an extra level of fade to the Cursed Dragon. It's fairly unusual, but you do see it. And again, this is not any kind of sun fading, because if you sun fade a card, it literally doesn't matter how long you leave it in the sun. You're never going to get any kind of black fading or anything like that. The other kind of fade that is worth mentioning, if we go back to trap cards, because that's the best one that I have an example of, is with ultra rare cards from LOB, MRD, STY, SDK especially. You do get examples where the gold of the title is kind of not really printed as it's meant to be. So you can see from most angles, this title almost looks kind of red rather than gold. And even if we put it under the light, there's a little bit of gold ink there, but definitely not as much as there's supposed to be. I'm not sure why that is, why that occurs on faded cards. I really don't have any idea how it's linked to the magenta ink process, but at the end of the day, it is a variety you find within these faded cards. It looks pretty awesome when all of the gold is gone and it's almost like a no-name error. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's another characteristic that it's worth mentioning for faded cards. So now moving on from that talk about like the different kinds of faded cards, I might as well quickly mention which sets you can find them for. So faded cards mostly exist in LOB, MRD, and the first two starter decks, but you do also find them for all of the other old school expansion sets up until Legacy of Darkness, and a few other products as well, like Tournament Pack 1, McDonald's Pack 1, Star Deck Pegasus and Star Deck Joey, and possibly one or two others. In general, the later in time you get, the less extreme the fading is. So like a Labyrinth of Nightmare or Legacy of Darkness fade tends to be a lot less noticeable than some of the LOB examples we've been looking at. Now, when it comes to talking about market value, faded cards are they're interesting, I would say, to talk about. Now, normally, when you look at kind of a variety, the biggest premiums will be paid on like the most expensive cards. So like in general, with wavy print, for example, even nowadays it does have, for a lot of cards, a premium over glossy. But where that premium is the most noticeable is actually on those Gem Mint first edition graded cards, and especially on the highest end graded cards like a wavy Red Eyes or a wavy Blue Eyes PSA 10 has a much bigger premium than something like a wavy Mystical Elf PSA 9 would have over a glossy, which is just going to be pretty much a few percent at the most. But with faded cards, it's actually the opposite. So really high-end cards like a first edition PSA 9 Blue Eyes White Dragon, that will still have a significant premium over a non-faded copy if you have a really faded one. But even for like a maximum fade first edition LOB card, I would say normally the premium is not more than around 100%, maybe a little bit more on a card like Flame Swordsman where it's really popular with the fade, but definitely nothing like you see for Unlimited. So this here is a 1.5 print Mystical Elf, and if this card wasn't faded, I would say it's pretty much not something that is of interest to collectors. I mean, you might find someone who like prefers 1.5 print to a regular OG or a reprint, and he's willing to pay 10-20% extra for it. But when you look at these super faded examples now, the same card that would be worth $5-10 if it was not faded can easily be worth $100 or even more. So I actually saw recently a pretty similar Mystical Elf to this, 1.5 print Unlimited, but it was actually heavy play condition. This one is like, near mint to mint. Auctioned on eBay for over $100, and that was kind of the auction that inspired me to make this video, because I saw that and I just thought that was absolutely crazy. A heavy play 1.5 print Mystical Elf is going to be like $1 or $2, really not more than that. So the fact that it can be $100 just because of the fade really goes to show how much depth there is in the faded market now, how many people are looking to buy these cards, and I guess how significant the premium can be over a full saturation copy. And it's worth noting that that premium is definitely only seen when the fade is extreme like this. If we bring something like this BGS 9 Mystical Elf here, this is somewhat faded. If we put it next to a full saturation, it'll look significantly different. But this kind of thing, it doesn't command anything like the same kind of premium as when they really look just totally different to a full saturation card. Again, like on this first edition Mystical Elf, because it's first edition and also because it's not that extreme a fade, I would say it's probably only worth maybe 10, 20, 30% more than a full saturation copy in this market. And that contrasts something like this 1.5 print, which based on the sales I've seen recently, and some other cards I've sold myself where I've had extras, put them up for sale and got like way higher offers than I expected. This could easily be worth 5 to 10 times more than if it was not faded, and honestly, possibly even more than 10 times more in some cases. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I have today, guys. I thought because these cards are getting so much more attention now, you're getting collectors literally just setting out to collect faded cards, it was worth making a video, kind of to set out the ballpark that we're dealing with in terms of the sets you can get these faded cards from, the different varieties, different degrees of fade. Just the last few things to say. Personally, I would never recommend purchasing any faded cards which are not North American English. I've seen some like Asian English faded cards being sold on eBay recently, but the reason you have to be very careful is that with North American cards from these old school sets, I already showed in my other video last year that if you put them out in the sun to try and replicate the factory error, the yellow ink strip fades first, and so you never have any chance to recreate the same effect. But with OCG cards like Asian English, because they're printed just completely differently, different technology, different ink, that's not actually true. And at least on the OCG holos that I've seen, sun faded, they actually have pretty much the same color balance as a faded North American English card that's a factory error. So that's why I would definitely recommend not to buy any Asian English cards that are faded, because I don't know if that's even a factory error that happened on those OCG printers. Quality control is a lot higher in Japan. It's pretty unlikely they would let something like that through. But B, even if it can be like a legitimate error, which is not confirmed, it definitely can be replicated by leaving the card out in the sun as well. And so I don't think that's really something that anyone should be paying a premium for. So yeah, that was kind of one of the last things I wanted to get out of the way that I didn't mention earlier in the video. Beyond that, yeah, have fun collecting faded cards, everyone. It's definitely an awesome variety, and I'm kind of glad that it's taken off, to be honest. With that being said, this is Schlost, signing out, and I will see you guys all in the next video.